Hi, I'm Jack Lescamella, a clerk for the Hollywood Public Library, part of the Los Angeles Public Library System. I'm going to be here today joined by science fiction, fantasy, and children's author Jane Yolen for a discussion about writing, about fantasy, about romance, and her life. Let me read the introduction here. Jane Yolen's 400th book was published in 2020. She's had a career that has spanned 6 decades and counting, with many highlights. She was president for 2 years of the Science Fiction Writers of America. She was on the board of the Society of Children's Book Writers for 45 years. Her books and stories won her 3 World Fantasy Awards, 2 Nebula Awards, 3 Mythopoeic Awards, 2 Christopher Medals, 3 awards from the Society of Book Writers and Illustrators, the Massachusetts Book Center Award, 2 Golden Kite Awards, a Caldecott Medal, and many others. She was nominated in 2020 by the United States for the Astrid Lindgren Award. She was the Western Massachusetts author to win a New England Public Radio Arts and Humanities Award. The first Western Massachusetts author to win that. She was the first woman to give the Andrew Lang Lecture at St. Andrews University in Scotland in a lecture series that started in 1927. She has 6 honorary doctorates for her vast body of work. Jane's here today to discuss The Scarlet Circus, a collection of classic romantic fantasy short stories out from Tachyon Publications. Hi, Jane.
Can you hear me now?
I can.
Good.
Hello, Jane.
You made me tired just listing all those things.
Yes, I could. Well, if I went into more depth, I could take up the entire hour reading off your CV. It's very impressive.
You can just call me doctor. You'll be fine.
I'll keep that in mind. So I read the book. I read The Scarlet Circus. It is a collection of previously published stories. That's it there. One of the things I enjoyed was the way you play with the conventions and tropes of fantasy. Okay, you'll introduce an idea or a character that we've seen before as readers, but then you put a twist on it, and it becomes new and refreshing again. I wanted to know how this collection came to be. Like, what was the genesis of putting this together?
This is actually, I think, the 4th or 5th book in a group of collections of my short stories. And when we were speaking about it, we had already done a horror one. We had done a folktale-ish one. We had done a mystery-ish one. And I was talking to the publisher, and he said, "What about romance?" I said, "I don't do romance." He said, "But you have some love stories." I said, "Yeah, but not romance." And so I went back and looked through all the magazine stories I had sold, all the short stories I had sold to collections, anthologies, my own collections of things. And I discovered, gosh, it turns out I wrote a lot of romance stories. I had not realized, 1, that I had written any. And then 2, I hadn't realized I had written that many, enough to put in a book.
Yeah, I really enjoyed, in particular, Dragonfield, The Sword and the Stone, and Ghost of an Affair.
Yeah, Ghost of an Affair, I think, is my favorite. But now that I am into a second marriage, Ghost of an Affair really has a meaning to me. I wrote it long before I met my second husband. But he and I knew each other in college. We had not seen each other since college, and we were both widowed, and we met again. So somehow that particular story resonates with me very strongly right now.
I can tell. I was thinking that too, because I had obviously read the introduction and everything, and read some stuff about you, and then read that, and I was like, wow, Like she must be feeling this one. This one must be hitting a little differently now.
Exactly. That's exactly right. When I wrote it, I was still happy in a wonderful, happy marriage that ended when my late husband got cancer and died at 69. So then I went 15 years before I got remarried. So rereading it for this book myself was like a visit into the past and the future at the same time.
That's wonderful. So I enjoyed your stories so much that I actually started another book by you as soon as like the same day that I finished this one. It dovetailed nicely into something that I had been online looking for Russian swashbuckling novels or something. I was like, there must be something like something about Imperial Russia with swords and all that. And I stumbled upon your book, The Last Tsar's Dragons, by you and your son Adam Stemple. So I have just started that. I'm at the beginning. I don't know if there's any swashbuckling, but it's close enough. Like I was like, I'm not going to ignore this sign. I'm going to read
No
it.
swatches and no buckling. But honestly, if you think you know how Rasputin dies, you're wrong.
Well, I look forward to that. I love Rasputin's one of my favorite figures from history. Um, one of the stories in your book, in the Scarlet Circus, The Sword and the Stone, is about King Arthur and the matter of Britain. And I really liked the changes that you rung on all that. Um, and I was wondering, I noticed that you have a book of Merlin stories called Merlin's Book. But my question is, have you ever put your spin on the entirety of the tales of King Arthur?
Um, well, not all the tales of King Arthur, but I have rewritten a number of them on in various ways. The first two books, really, that I ever read that I totally understood and kept forever. One was Alice in Wonderland, and one was this the what I don't remember which one it was, but one was the Arthurian stories, um, and and I was probably about 5 years old at the time. My parents had given me the double volume Alice in Wonderland, Alice in Wonderland, and Alice Through the Looking Glass.
Right, right.
And then I found in there because in their bookshelves, because they always let me, even at that young age, troll through their bookshelf, was was King Arthur. And I read that, and those two stories became bedrock for me. Those two worlds became bedrock for me.
Right.
I can still recite all of Alice in Wonderland's Jabberwocky poem. I do it; it's my party piece. Um, but but my brother, who is 4 years younger than me, and our next door neighbor, who was a year younger than me, when we were living in New York City, we lived across from the Central Park West, and my friend Diane and I were allowed to take my brother Steve when he was younger over across the street and into Central Park West, and we used to play at swords and dragons, and none of us wanted to be the female characters. We only wanted to be like we had two Merlins and an Arthur or something like that.
Right, right.
Um, so when it came time that I wanted to write some Arthurian things, I wanted to sort of renovate and reinvent um, female characters in in the Arthurian saga. So a lot of what I did was part of that, was lifting up and making stronger the female characters in it, for good or for evil.
Well, I find that when you do things like that, it actually, and I'm sure that some men would disagree with me, but I find that it makes the men more interesting just as a result as well, because they have to rise up to meet the challenge
There's
that
an
the
adjustment there that they have to make, isn't
yeah,
there?
and
Yeah.
it's like it's like romantic comedies or whatever, or screwball comedies. Like,
Mhm.
you know, Cary Grant has to be able to match Katharine Hepburn or whatever.
Yeah.
Otherwise, she's going to walk all over him or
Yep.
whatever.
Yep. Yep.
And you know, and you want that back and forth. So yeah, I really loved the Sword in the Stone. Um, I'm still able when I mean, I've read a lot of fiction, but when I read fiction, there's a part of my brain that sort of shuts off so that I can still be delighted by it. So, you know, and that was the case with that. I didn't see the twists coming, and I was delighted.
You
Um,
are my favorite reader from now on.
Thank you. Let me see. So I understand that both of your parents were writers, though
Yes.
neither was published. Is that right?
No, my they were both published, but in odd ways. My
Oh, okay.
father had been a newspaperman,
Right.
and then he had been during World War II. He had been head of ABSI, which was the Allied Broadcasting Company in London, and they were sending out disinformation to the uh, to the Germans and the German allies, and then when he came back to America, he became president of the Overseas Press Club for about 10 years, and then he became a public relations man. And in that time, he also became international kite flying champion.
Ah,
He was Western Hemisphere kite flying champion. And being a public relations man, he was able to get articles about himself in the newspapers. And he claimed that he was the Western Hemisphere kite flying champion. And then he had to just defend it, right? But one day he got a call of a letter from the Maharaja of Bharatpur, who said, I am the Eastern Hemisphere kite flying champion, and I challenge you to a duel. And here are 2 tickets. Come, and I will fight. We will have a kite fight together to discover who is the international kite flying champion. And my father, being a very smart man and very wary and interested in always coming out on top of things, called a friend of his who was Red Smith, who at that time was the most famous New York City um, uh, writer of sports columns.
right.
And the 2 of them went over. And Red wrote a series of columns about how Will Yolen won the International Kite Flying Championship. We will never know if he actually did. We will never know. I'm sure that in Bharatpur and all of India, the Maharaja is the international kite flying champion. But they came back,
That would
and
be wonderful.
so
If everything there is like talks about meeting your dad, and it's like he was not up to the Maharaja's like
exactly,
amazing kite flying like prowess.
exactly.
Um,
So so
and the kite flying ties into the other story I love, Dragonfield.
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
I
and
did
it's
not realize
directly.
that it came from such a rich place in your history.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, all writers write from out of their history and other things, and that was mine. So my father was asked to write the Young Sportsman's Guide to Kite Flying. It was a series of books for middle grade readers. The Young Sportsman's Guide to Baseball, the Young Sportsman's
Right.
Guide to Basketball, etc. And he accepted, and he signed the contract. And then he said to me, and he got paid. And then he said to me, "You're going to write it." And that was actually the first book I ever wrote, but my name is not on it. Um, and I think he gave me $200
Nice.
for writing it. Actually, my name is under the end of the second chapter. I have no idea
So
why.
would this have been the 1950s?
No, I was already out of college, and I came out of college in the 1960s.
Okay, well, even so, 1960s, $200 is pretty good money.
No, well, it was not even, he got a lot of money for to write
Right,
the
right.
book. So anyway, so that was, but he also, quote, authored 5 or 6 other books, all of which were written by other people.
Your dad sounds like a real character.
He was a character. My mother wanted desperately to write, and she wrote women's fiction of the day. She sold one story that she wrote with a friend, and then she never sold another thing. Later on, after she died, I found her stories, and I read through them because I'm a good daughter. And you know what? They were terrible.
Uh,
Awful. She was so smart. I mean, she had been valedictorian or salutatorian of her college, university, school, but her writing, when she was writing those stories, was writing down rather than writing,
ah,
because she had her idea of who was going to be reading those stories, and it was below her.
gotcha.
But what she ended up doing was selling a lot of. She made double cross sticks and crossword puzzles, and she sold a lot of those. But
That's
all of my parents' friends, seemed to be adult friends, seemed to be writers like Hemingway and James Thurber and people like that. And they would
wait,
come to the
your
house.
parents were friends with Hemingway and Thurber?
Yes.
Wow.
And so people would come to the house, and they would be writers of renown in one way or another. And I assumed when I was a child living in New York City, I knew the baker and the butcher and the policeman on the block, and I knew adults did other work. And I figured that adults all had day jobs, but at night they went home and wrote.
Right.
So I knew that whatever else I did as my day job, I was going to go home at write at night.
Yeah.
It turned out I did become a writer, but I write day, night, in between.
I'm sort of caught up in the possibility of your father having Hemingway write a book for him.
No,
So
that never happened.
I know, but it's
Neither did James Thurber. But they were friends, and I got to meet them.
that's wonderful. So I know. So in addition to then your parents' friends, what writers inspired you when you were starting out or when you were a girl? Like, who made you want to be a writer?
Well, certainly Alice in Wonderland.
Right.
The author of Alice in Wonderland did, and whoever wrote the various versions of the Arthurian. I think that by the time I was in high school, I was writing for the high school newspaper and writing poetry for the high school literary magazine. Same thing when I was at Smith College. I was writing all the time, but I was also writing music and music lyrics all the way from the time I was in first grade.
Right.
And then children or grown-up children, we all acted in them and sang in them. So poetry was my second language in a sense. But I wouldn't say any one person. I majored in English and minored in Russian literature, but not, in translation. I didn't speak Russian in college. And I became an editor after college for a while. And I learned reading other people's manuscripts that I was a good writer. The more you saw someone else's manuscript, the more you understood what were the pitfalls and how to make your own manuscript better. So that was key for me.
How long were you an editor for?
I was an editor.
I mean, that stint.
Yeah, that stint. I was an editor for 5 years at Knopf Children's Books,
Right. Right.
And then I went to, my husband and I then went off to Europe for a year, riding around in a VW camper bus. And we came home and had a baby. So we moved to the country. And then a few years later, Harcourt Brace, with whom I had a good relationship with because I was doing a lot of books with them, asked me if I would have my own science fiction fantasy imprint, because none of them knew much about fantasy and science fiction. And by then I had already been president of the Science Fiction Writers of America,
Right.
which helped me find good writers for the imprint. And I said yes, and I did that for 9 years. And now I just teach writing occasionally.
Very good. So you brought up living in the country. That brings me to another question that I have. I noticed a real attention to and fondness for nature in your writing. And then I was like, oh, she grew up in New York City. So when you were growing up in New York, did you long did you long for the country, and for that sort of thing, or
We had the park right outside the
right?
door. And I went to, for two separate summers. My brother and I went to a Quaker camp up in Vermont in the summer. And I had just gotten into music and art, high school. And my parents sent a letter to us at the camp saying, your aunt and uncle are going to pick you up and bring you to your new home because we have bought a house in Westport, Connecticut.
Wow.
So I went from going to music and art, where I really wanted to go, to suddenly being thrown into a high school full of Westport kids I didn't know, who had been together mostly for, their entire lives up through the Westport system. And it was a shocker.
Huh.
So no, that was not what I wanted to do.
Right.
But I then became very interested in what was on outside the house, and we were very, very next to a little river that ran by, and I would go sit on a rock with a piece of paper and a pen, and I would write poems. When I was out of college, I met a young man who became my first husband, and he was from West Virginia. And we met in New York City. It was the first time he had been out of West Virginia. He came to New York City, and he worked at IBM because he was an early programmer. But he had spent all of his life on a mountaintop in West Virginia, hunting, fishing, looking at birds, stalking animals. I mean, he knew everything about this. I knew New York City, and mourned having lost, New York City. So when we were having our romance, one weekend we went out to the end of Long Island, took a little, rented a little house for the weekend. And as we walked out, he said, if you're very, very quiet, we might see a deer. I said, okay. And we tiptoed over to these dunes, and a deer jumped out in front of us, its white tail flagging, and just ran away. And I thought, this man is magic, and I'm going to marry him. And after we were married, he explained, he said there were deer tracks everywhere in Scat. Of course there was a deer there, but he was thinking like a West Virginian. He was thinking like a man who had grown up, in that kind of milieu. I was thinking like a New Yorker. Oh my God, that's magic.
That's
And
great.
he was an absolute uh, stunning birder, and he was out all the time birding and filling notebooks full of what birds he had seen, etc. And all three of our children, and then the grandchildren, um, got to go out birding with him, and he taught the whole family. I'm the worst. I mean, I'm still pigeons are, flying rats, but everybody else in the family got to be really, really good birders.
So that brings me to, so your family is like good at owling,
Very
is
good
that,
at owling. Yes,
and right,
my daughter who you met,
yeah,
um, takes the on the Christmas bird count. She takes out a group of people to count owls for the Christmas bird count, the Audubon Christmas bird count. But she's birding all the time. Her youngest brother is a nature photographer, and her middle brother is a writer. Well, they're all writers, and two of the grandchildren are writers. So this writing group, that this dynasty of writers just continues.
that's great. So for you, getting back to your writing, for a fantasy writer, your writing is aware of and even revels in science and learning things about the real world. Have you always had this interest in science?
No, that was David. That was my husband. He was a scientist. He was a computer scientist, but he was also a scientist in the core. I am of the, oh, it's magic. The world is magic. I don't know what makes this go here or what makes that go there or why these things come together. It's all magic. It's like the deer jumping up in front
Right.
of me. Um, and I'm always surprised and delighted, and I get story ideas when I walk out. Um, we, the family owns, I own now, I guess, a 14-acre farm that we live on called Phoenix Farm. We were going to call it, the children wanted to call it Fee Fi Fo Farm. And then I decided to write a series of books about the giants who lived on Fee Fi Fo Farm. Uh, so that's how things happen in our family.
Right.
And what I know of life, the outdoor life, comes from my first husband and my second husband, who was also a birder and a teacher, as my first husband was, and sending the kids out on their own on this 14-acre farm with their field glasses and their tracks, their books of tracks, so that they could see what they might find along the way. But I could always stand on the deck or even just look out of the big picture window in the kitchen with my field glasses and see them. And they had to keep the house. This is when they were 3, 5, and 7 with
Right.
their backpacks on. They had to not go near the river, the little river. They could only go up to it, but they couldn't get any closer. And they had to keep that house in and they didn't know until they were grown up that I had been watching them the whole time.
Nice. So let me say for anyone watching that if you have questions, you can put them in the comments and I'll be able to read them. I should have said that earlier. Let's see. Heidi. Oh, Heidi says, "Hey, don't lay that at our feet. You wanted to call it Fee Fi Fo Farm." So,
And they said no, it was called Phoenix Farm. But they were the ones who said, actually, they said, why don't you write a book about Fee Fi Fo Farm? Which I did.
so you started out in journalism.
Hmm. I was a
Um,
lousy journalist.
you were a lousy journalist.
I made it,
Oh,
well, because I made stuff up.
well, that. Well, so I was going to ask you: is there
At
any
least I
world?
admit it. I admit it.
Right. How did you? So your natural gift for making things up kind of just ushered you into writing fiction?
Yes, yes. Actually, I was writing poetry for years and years, and some of it was getting published. But I thought about writing fiction, but I had never written anything long except essays for the class, in the classroom. Um, but I reached a point in my writing that it was time to make the next step into books. And I didn't just want to write nonfiction, unless I can make it up.
Right, right.
So I started thinking about children's books because they were like, especially picture books, are very much like long poems.
Oh,
And I
I
write
never
very
really thought about that.
yeah, and I write very lyrically. So picture books like Owl Moon, which I wrote, which was a long poem, and I have a series of books called How Did Dinosaurs, and it's How Did Dinosaurs Say Goodnight? How did dinosaurs,
Right.
you know, do
How
this?
the
I call it,
dinosaurs learned to read. How the
yes,
dinosaurs.
I call it my dynasty. Um, but I was very nervous about writing anything longer because I'm not a good plotter. But I learned that I could write novels by just starting at the beginning and going and finding the end along the way.
Very good.
So the people who think that's goofy call us pantsers because we're flying by
Right.
the seat of our pants. But I call it flying into the mist. And so
Well,
short stories and novels, I write that way. I have a general idea of where I'm going, but I like to be surprised along the way.
that's. I think that's what Donald E. Westlake did too.
Yeah.
So yeah, the I know of like Tim Powers. I know has to write everything. He has big charts or whatever, and he knows what his characters are doing on every page or whatever. And
My son Adam Stemple is that way.
yeah,
He has to plot everything. Now, when we've written some books together, he draws out the plot and then he tells me where the book is going.
wow, that's interesting. That he is the
Absolutely.
opposite.
Yeah.
So do you two work together? Well, obviously you've done books together, but
Yeah.
do you was there initially some friction when you tried to work to make the
The,
two ways of working fit?
the only friction came when he would labor over a chapter and then he would send it to me after we talked a lot about where
Right.
the book was going. And he'd send it to me and he'd say, yeah. And half an hour later, it came back. He said, with my stuff fixed and a new chapter from you. So when I'm working on things, I can be very fast, but I
Right.
go over it and over it and over it and over it once it's down. I mean, I'm a demon reviser because I think that's where books are really built. You get it down. And if you get it down in a heart's rush, which is how I write very often, you have to go back and smooth things out and fix things and maybe say that's not the right ending. This is a better ending.
Right.
Whereas the people who plot it out don't have to do that, but I have to go back and fix everything.
That's great. Let me 1 second. Let's see what the comments say. Uh, Just in case says, "Hi Jane, long time no see. We met in Copenhagen some years ago. Ellen Datlow and Alistair Reynolds were also present."
I've never been in Copenhagen, so it must have been someone else.
Sorry, Justin. And Barbara Metzenbaum says, "What brought Jane to writing The Devil's Arithmetic? It's so far away from many of your books."
I was having lunch with my editor, Deborah Brody, who was a Rebbitzin. That means she was a wife of a rabbi as well as an editor. And we were sitting there. I had done a couple of books with her. And she said, I know you're Jewish. Why haven't you ever written anything about being Jewish? And I said, that's because I was not raised in any kind of worship situations. I was just raised as a kid who knew that she was Jewish because her family was Jewish.
Right.
And she said, well, I think you should. And if you did, what kind of a novel would you like to write? And I went, well, maybe if it I can have a science fiction element to it, so that a kid from now went back in time to the Holocaust. She said, "You write it, I'll publish it." I said, "Yeah, but I can't do it." She said, "Yes, you can." And she became a nudge, so that this was long before computers. So she
Right.
would call me once a week or once every other week and say, "What's happening with our novel? What's happening with the book?" And so to shut her up, because she was getting annoying, right? I wrote the first chapter in which the girl goes back in time. And I said, "See, it can't be done." And she wrote back and said, "I'm sending you a check, and I'm buying the book." So
You can't get out of it.
I couldn't get out of it. Yeah. And in some ways, it's the best novel I've ever written.
I'll have to put it on the list for sure.
Yeah. And it's also one that's been banned more times than any of my other
Well,
books.
I mean, that's an imprimatur of greatness right there. Like,
Oh, I had one book that was burned on the steps of the Board of Education in Kansas City.
well, which one's that one? So we all
Well,
know
it's
what to read.
another Holocaust novel,
Briar Rose.
Briar Rose, and it was
Okay.
banned because it had gay characters in it. A gay character
Wow.
was the lead, one of the leads.
Right. They're still doing that. Let's see. Um, you've written a few graphic novels in recent years.
Yep.
Do you enjoy writing comics? And were you a comics reader growing up?
I read the Archie comics when I was growing up, but I also secretly would come home from school with a series of comics called The Crypt.
Oh, Tales from the Crypt.
Tales from the Crypt, which I hid in the front of my pants and went into the bathroom. A friend who had got all of them, and I would go into the bathroom, lock the door, and I would read the thing, and then I would come out and hide it in my school bag and take it back the next day. My parents never knew that I was
Among
reading
the
them.
best comics ever made.
Scary as anything, though.
Yeah.
Really scary. I've written one published one published verse novel, a couple of graphic novels that have been published. I think six graphic novels.
Okay.
One was a trilogy, and one was just a regular book, I think. And I love graphic novels. I don't read a lot of them, but the ones I read, I'm passionate about. I think that not all stories lend themselves to graphic novels, but now they're doing interesting hybrids of graphic novels that are hybrids of regular novels with sections that are in graphic novels, which might be interesting to explore.
Right. So your work has included novels, short stories, graphic novels, poetry, nonfiction, and no doubt some areas I haven't listed.
Well, both adult and children's books,
Right.
picture books, middle grade novels, teenage novels. I've now done librettos for 3 operas with 3 different composers. I was in a
was going to
band.
ask if you were going to write a musical, but
Yes. I was at age 80. I was in a band and wrote all the lyrics to the songs. We broke up after a year. That's normal for bands, right?
right.
But I couldn't sing anymore. I was a pretty good alto blues singer at one point.
You're not a good singer anymore.
I have no voice left.
Oh wow. I
Yeah.
would have thought that you. I think that your voice has a musicality to it.
Well, I was an alto.
Is there? Do you have a favorite form to work in?
I think poetry.
Poetry.
But all kinds of poetry. Some is rhymed, some is not rhymed, some is very formal. I did a whole book of now the word is defeating me. 14 lines. What are they called? Sonnets. I wrote, I think, 2 books of sonnets. I wrote a book after my first husband died. My second husband and I wrote a book of poems together called the Black Dog Poems, because when we met, his black dog, this female alpha, gorgeous poodle, standard poodle, sniffed me all over and decided I was worth keeping. Yeah, it was worth keeping. So lots of different kinds of poetry, children's poems. I have a huge book coming from Random House of 150 poems for kids called In and Out the Window. And it's like the first section is the family, and it's inside and outside, and then in school, inside and outside, and then pets, inside and outside, sports, inside and outside, that kind of thing. And there are, I think, maybe even slightly over 150 poems in it.
And when does that come out?
Well, I've seen the cover.
Okay, so probably so this year, probably.
Maybe if the book is going to be illustrated inside, and which it may be, then it may not come out until next year. But I think that it may come out this year.
Okay, so Barbara thanks you for answering her question about the Devil's Arithmetic, and also asks. She says, "I think Wizard's Hall would make a great film. Has anyone ever approached you about
it?" Approach is a hard word. There, unless you have something that is absolutely a runaway bestseller, nobody really approaches you. I have an agent who sends my books, who is an agent for movies and TV, and sends my books to various people. I'm working with a friend now for doing the dinosaur books as what is it called on television?
Animated series?
An animated series, but so we're working on that right now. I have one of my other books has been taken for a movie. Devil's Arithmetic came out as a movie on television movie and won 3 Emmys. But
that's pretty good.
You know, it's nice when it happens, but it doesn't happen all the time. And we're always looking, we're always sending them out. And people sometimes hold them for years to say, and then they decide, well, they're not going to do it. So I've had a bunch of them that have been taken for the people to sit and think about them and maybe toss the idea out to a company that might want to do it. So there are not a lot of them right now, but I guess after I die, there'll probably be many.
That always brings about a lot of interest. Let's see. Justin says, it was Glasgow in 2005, not Copenhagen.
Yes, Glasgow, yes, at the Worldcon.
All right. Let's see. Wait. TC Long says, when you go back and revise, do you edit your own work the same way you edited other people's in the past? Do you use the same set of eyes? If not, how does editor Jane work with writer Jane?
When I go back to look at my own stuff, I read it out loud. Because I hear better than I see. Does that make sense to you? My language is very, because I'm a poet, my language is very, it needs to be lyrical. It needs to be, it needs to have that certain touch to it. And I'm also a terrible typist. I never learned to type. So when I'm going back over things, half of the time I'm changing the word so that it is an actual word.
Gotcha.
And half the time I'm changing something because it doesn't sound right to me.
Gotcha. That's
That's
good.
that's but I always read it aloud, which is why I like to have my writing room where nobody else is in the house. Because otherwise they hear me reading something aloud and then saying terrible words because I've made a mistake.
So Heidi jumps in and says, Wizard's Hall cannot ever become a movie. It is about a small boy who is a wizard who goes away to wizard school and befriends a redheaded boy and the smartest girl in class. Together they save. You see where I'm going with this.
It was published 8 years before Harry Potter.
I believe it was.
Yeah, it has pictures on the wall that change and move. It has a wicked wizard who is trying to destroy the school. I mean, little things like that.
There was well, they have similarities to a lot of books in the
In the fantasy world.
right.
Yeah.
There's Neil Gaiman did books of magic.
Mhm.
Maybe around the same time that you did your book.
Yep.
And they tried to gin up like this anger from him against her, and he's like, no, she's not ripping anybody off. Like, she's just doing
We
what the
all
tropes
went.
are. Yeah,
We all went to the same well.
right.
She just happened. The thing that she really invented with the kids flying around and playing hockey on
Right.
in the sky. Everything else was just straight out of Fantasyville.
Okay, so is you've written so many books and stories. Is there one that stands out as a favorite work for you?
I have, I think, 3. One is Devil's Arithmetic. One is Owl Moon, which is really about a father who takes a child out owling. So it's really a family story, and the child in it is really my daughter Heidi. But and the third one is my dynasties, because those and interestingly enough, those are the ones that have resonated most with my public.
Now, did you ever tell the editor that got you to write the Devil's Arithmetic? Did you ever tell her how much you value that book now?
Well, she's been dead for some time, so I
Oh,
haven't been able to
sorry.
say it. But she knew, because the book was already doing really well, and it's still in print, and it's still getting it's still getting banned in schools.
Let's see. So your son Adam Stemple is he's in the band Boiled and Lead.
Well, he was.
He was.
Yeah.
And you said that you had a band. Do you play an instrument
Uh,
yourself?
I used to play the piano, but I can't play the piano anymore. That's how I got into music and art, on piano and voice.
Okay.
But I spent a lot of time in college being the lead singer in front of a man a handsome young man who played the banjo and the guitar and the squeeze box. And we would perform. He went to Trinity in Hartford, Connecticut, and I went to Smith College. So we spent 3 or 4 years doing that. And you could probably tell I have no trouble in front of audiences. And it's one of the things where you see me, I may be sitting there and I'm very quiet, and suddenly you put me in front of an audience, and I am like this. So that's not problematic.
Right. So you have a second home in Scotland. What drew you to that country in particular?
Well, my first husband was part Scottish, part English, all West Virginian. And he was a professor at UMass Amherst, and a tenured professor, and so he was getting sabbaticals. And the first sabbatical we took in Edinburgh because we had taken a trip to England and then went up to Scotland because of ancestry stuff. He was a Douglas clan, and he was related to the Black Douglas. Black Douglas was Robert the Bruce's right-hand man, the man who did everything for him, every dirty deed.
Right.
I have a wonderful story about the Black Douglas I love. But so we fell in love with Scotland. And for his next sabbatical, we rented a house in St. Andrews because he was starting to work with all the people at St. Andrews University. And we fell in love with the house and we ended up buying it. I mean, it's a longer story than that, but that's the shorthand.
Very good. Very good. Let's see. Let's see. Valentine's Day is coming up next week. I'm wondering if you would tell everyone the story about meeting your second husband. Now, you sort of already alluded to it at the beginning of the interview.
Yes, we spent in college. He was in Williams and I was at Smith, and we had a poetic romance for 2 months, mostly sitting in his dorm room talking about our favorite poets, because he was the poet at Williams and I was the poet at Smith College. And in those days, nobody else, Emily Dickinson was not popular yet. This was 1959. And so we had a wonderful time. And then, it was time just to say goodbye. It's been fun playing at poetry with you. And I went back to my school, and he went back to his school. And 2 weeks later, he met the woman that he was going to marry. And they had a long, wonderful marriage. And I, after college, went to New York City, where I met my husband-to-be. And we had a not quite as long, lovely marriage when he died at 69. And then Peter's wife they both died of cancer. And Peter was 5 years a widower, and I was 17 years, 15 or 16 years a widow. And there was an article in the New Yorker about 3 of my Holocaust books. Now, the New Yorker had never published me, never reviewed me. And suddenly there's this article by someone I've never heard of, who didn't even ask me about, contact me about the things at all, just wrote this wonderful article about teenage Holocaust novels, but mostly talked about my 3. It was 5.5 pages. And suddenly I get this note from Peter, who I had met at 2 different conferences, because he was an independent school head of school, or a teacher at a bunch of different independent schools. And he was very often running conferences, and I was one of the speakers. And he came up to me at that time and said, "Do you remember Peter Tacey?" And I'm terrible on the names, terrible. And I went, "Peter Tacey," because people come up all the time and say, "Oh, I love your books," and then they think we're best friends. And honestly, I'm sorry, I just don't remember names, especially now at 84. I really don't remember names. And he came up and said, "Do you remember Peter Tacey?" And I went, Peter Tacey. And I went, "Williams College," which surprised me as much as it surprised him. That was the extent of our meeting, actually, until he wrote years later, after his wife had died, and this article had appeared. And so we started corresponding. And then he said, "I'm going to be going to the Emily Dickinson Museum. I've never seen it. Is it anywhere near you?" And I said, 20 minutes away. So we met at the museum, and we had lunch after. And it started, you know. But we were sort of dating. We weren't exactly dating. And then we decided to go and visit a friend of his down in Miami. We were there for 2 days, and she's really a Canadian, and she's very tied in with all of sort of, she used to be assistant to the Canadian Prime Minister, and she gets a call from someone saying, if you don't get up here now, the border is closing because of this COVID thing. And so we realized we had to get back too. And we got stuck at Peter's house because they closed the border between Connecticut and Massachusetts for a while. So we spent 3 months in his house and realized that we were meant to spend the rest of our lives together.
Great story.
So, yeah.
I meant to ask, is his name Peter related to Peter in Wonderland, the title of that story?
I think I wrote that story before I met him, but I'm not sure.
Before you met him the second time.
The second time, yeah.
Gotcha.
But
okay,
I
was just wondering,
I probably couldn't have pulled the name Peter Tacey out of my head until the moment he said that.
All right, so let's see. We've got 4 minutes left. Let's see. Oh, all right. Let's see. Are you working on anything right now? Like a new novel or anything right now? Or
silly man. I'd love to go when I used to go to faculty parties with my husband, and someone would come up and say, "Oh, hi, Mrs. Stemple. Are you still writing?" And I would say, "Are you still breathing?" Yes, I have I have sold 34 books that'll be coming out over the next few years.
So you were well into reaching the 500th book or whatever.
Yes, but I still have probably 100 unsold manuscripts, which I go back and try to fix up so that they will be good enough to sell. I just sold one of the old ones.
Excellent.
But it was because the publisher saw, they liked it, but they didn't like the ending, and I worked on the ending for them, and then it was perfect. So I love revision. Revision is what makes a book.
Good to know. Here's my last question. Well, let me check. Justin says, would you mind elaborating a bit on the sci-fi by H.C. Andersen, whom I know you adore?
Well, I have been called the Hans Christian Andersen of America. I keep explaining I'm the Hans Jewish Andersen of America. Nobody listens. I about 4 years ago was asked if I would rewrite some of the Hans Christian Andersen stories so that they could bring them out again in a kind of new edition. And I looked at the editor there and I said, many of them are very anti-female. Many of the stories are really, really bad things always happen to women in those stories. I would do it only if I could somehow make the stories work a little more in the direction towards empowering the young women in the stories. The match girl, dies. The girl runs off. Her feet are chopped off. Just another girl stands on a piece of bread and ends up in a snake pit for the rest of her life. I mean, it goes on and on. The Little Mermaid. All right. So they said, okay. And then I started working on this. I said, I would love to have a different woman illustrator for each of the stories. They were very excited about the project. Then the editor moved somewhere else, and the new editor was in England. So she asked me to send me the 3 pieces I'd already worked on, and she wrote back and she said, "These are really dark." I said, "Have you read any Hans Christian Andersen?" So that was the end of that project.
Ah,
But
all right.
I do find Andersen interesting, and I've written a short story about Hans Christian Andersen that was in one of my early Tachyon things. He had a horrible upbringing and had a lust to be famous that outweighed everything. And he wanted to be a macher, a poet.
Right.
And so it was an interesting thing to try to write a short story about Hans Christian Andersen. So I admire what he accomplished,
Right.
but there's a lot that I didn't like about him.
Gotcha. All right. It's 5:01 now, so I suppose I should bring this to a close. I'm going to ask one more question,
Okay.
which is, do you have with the life you've lived and the career that you've had, and the new book that's out, do you have any insights about love or writing or romance that perhaps have came to you while you were putting the new book together?
Seize the day. I mean,
Very,
we Peter and I met when I was 80 and he was 82. Seize the day. As I said, I'd been a widow for, I think, 15, 17 years. And I hadn't realized how lonely I was until after we decided we were a couple. And then I went, oh my gosh, I'm really happy again in a way that I hadn't been happy in 15 years. So I think as far as romance goes, seize the day. As far as reading goes, read across, read everything. Don't just only read fantasy or science fiction or mysteries or romance novels or whatever. Read across, because you will find romance in, I don't know, War and Peace. You will find mysteries in funny books. So that read everything, and don't, for gosh sake, stop throwing children's books out.
Thank you.
Because I just was reading another horrible article about what was going on in it was down in Florida. Give the teachers, the librarians, and the kids, understand they have brains. They can figure out what works for them, what doesn't work for them, but don't take that away.
Agreed. Thank you very much, Jane.
My pleasure. My pleasure. And
Okay.
thank you.
Don't hang up just yet, but
Okay.
I'm going to. I guess I'll bring this to a close. This has been the Los Angeles Public Library in conversation with science fiction, fantasy, and children's writing superstar Jane Yolen. I'm Jack Lescamella, clerk for the Hollywood Public Library. Jane's new book. Can you hold up the book?
I can.
Jane?
There it
Jane's
is.
new book, the Scarlet Circus, is out now in bookstores and in your local library. Please give it a read. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you, everyone, and especially to you, Jack.
Thank you. All right.